this. Got it. I want to welcome everybody to this, our first session of the University Study Group on Europe since COVID. This is the first of 2021-2022, but we did a whole series of lectures on Europe since COVID last year, and the recordings are available on our Facebook page if you want to go back and look at them. We had some really terrific events last year, and we're planning another year full of interesting speakers and events related to Europe. We look forward to one in the spring for the French elections. And today we are going to be discussing the German elections. I'm Hilary Silver. I'm a professor of sociology, international affairs, and public policy at George Washington University, and I will be moderating today's events. We are going to hear presentations from two speakers of about 20 minutes each, and then we will address your questions, which I invite you to put into the chat box. So just to introduce the topic very briefly, on Sunday, September 26th, Germany held its most consequential election in 16 years, as Angela Merkel is moving into caretaker status as Chancellor, and her successor is actually still uncertain. During the 2021 campaign, the frontrunners unpredictably switched between the Greens, the Green leader Annalena Baerbock and CDU leader Armin Laschet, towards the SPD's Olaf Scholz. And the polls, down to the wire, remain too close to call. But this nail-biter election has determined that SPD has pulled ahead with 25.7% of the vote, compared to the Union, the CDU, and the CSU conservatives, who have 24.1%, which is a staggering decline of almost 9% since 2017. The Greens had their best showing yet at 14.8%, but this still was a loss over their earlier lead. There are a number of missteps there. So these results mean that the next governing coalition can only reach a majority in the Bundestag, with some unlikely alliances among three parties. And that's probably going to be what we call a traffic light coalition, which is red, yellow, green, as you can imagine. But there's still the possibility of a Jamaica coalition with the conservatives, which hasn't been ruled out. It is unlikely that a grand coalition like the one that's currently in power is going to be formed. And those are the only three mathematically possible. And to discuss these momentous election results and to put them into some scholarly perspective, our seminar on Europe since COVID is going to have a discussion between two Washington, D.C. experts on German politics who've just come back from site visits to Germany, where they met with party insiders and opinion makers. And I will, before I introduce them, I just wanted to show you, if I can share my screen, a couple of unbelievable, let me say share, a couple of unbelievable findings that comes from the Financial Times. So if you can, if you want to have a closer look at these amazing charts, you can see just how momentous this election is. First of all, you can see from the trends at the top that the two Volkspartei, People's Parties, usually always have a majority of the electorate, but you can see how their common share, their sum, has declined considerably. And only twice really in the recent past has the SPD surpassed the conservative CDU in its share of votes. And it was a real nail biter. This really shows you at the very end, and you at the very end just how much they came together at the end, but still have together a very small percentage of the total, and that the Greens have reached their highest result possible ever historically, and that the Linke have been declining, and the far left party, the Alternativen für Deutschland, has declined somewhat, and therefore this dispels a lot of fears. And the Free Democratic Party has experienced a gain as well. So where did the CDU's support go to? Merkel's party really cratered, and this is an amazing interactive map that they put together. And as you can see, the CDU lost votes to the socialists, to the SPD, and to the Greens, and did not automatically move people to the liberals, as you might expect. So this is a really interesting study of how people who changed their vote over the two elections, where they ended up. So I wanted to share that with you. Now, to discuss the final results and put them in this larger perspective, we have Hope Harrison, who is professor of history and international affairs, who's just come back from a DAAD-sponsored delegation observing the elections. And Dr. Harrison is the author of After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the present, and she's an expert on post-1945 German history. Eric Longenbacher is a teaching professor and director of the honors program in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. And since July 2019, he's also a senior fellow and director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies here in DC. And his recent publications include Twilight of the Merkel Era, Power and Politics in Germany After the 2017 Bundestag Election, and Dynamics of Memory and Identity in Contemporary Europe. He's also managing editor of German Politics and Society, which is housed at Georgetown's BMW Center for German and European Studies. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the Zoom room to Hope Harrison.
All right. Thank you, Hillary. It's great to see you and everyone for joining. Thanks so much for coming. Yes, I just returned last night, in fact, so my brain is a little bit foggy, but I just got back last night from 2 weeks in Germany, mostly in Berlin, but also some up in the north in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, up on the Baltic Sea, a little in Brandenburg, and some in Saxon-Anhalt, but most of the time in Berlin. This trip was sponsored by the German Academic Exchange Program, the DAAD, which is kind of an equivalent to Fulbright in the US. And every 4 years, they send an international delegation to Germany to observe the elections. So I was with a group from all over the world. Some had to cancel, I think, due to COVID at the last minute. But we ended up with a wonderful delegation of 9 people, mostly women, as it turned out, a couple of men, historians, political scientists, and journalists. And we had a packed schedule, sometimes 14-hour days, meeting with electoral candidates, going to different rallies, traveling to the city of Halle, a couple of hours south of Berlin, meeting with experts on elections and on German society. So it was an amazing trip for this really historic election. So I am going to also share my screen and yeah, take take us through a couple of things that Hillary began introducing already. So the results, over 75% of the voters turned out. Now, from an external perspective, it is neck and neck between the SPD and the CDU. The CDU is the black column, the SPD the red. CDU dropped a lot, SPD gained. So, you know, from the outside, the results look close, but this, as Hillary mentioned, this was a historic low for the CDU. There's all sorts of finger pointing of who screwed things up, particularly Armin Laschet, who was and remains the main chancellor candidate. Most famously or infamously, over the summer, when President Frank-Walter Steinmeier was giving an address in the western part of Germany for the victims of the terrible floods that occurred there, washing out homes and killing people, Laschet could be seen in the background laughing. And this image of sort of not paying attention to the president, first of all, and not really focusing on commemorating the victims of these floods and how terrible it was, really, really cost Laschet a lot. There were also mistakes in the Greens, but Scholz has Scholz basically ran as the incumbent, the continuation of Merkel, even though they're from different parties. He is in her government. He has been the finance minister, but his calm demeanor seemed to remind many Germans of Merkel. So much so that at one point she had to remind people that, you know, Scholz from the SPD is not her preferred candidate, that in fact Laschet from her own party is. So while from the outside, the two leaders look, you know, pretty close, and yes, you know, the SPD won, but, you know, one could think, oh, there's not that huge of a difference between the two of them. You know, in Germany, there's much talk of the downfall of the CDU and certainly of Laschet. It's not clear how long he'll hold on to power. With Angela Merkel having done so well for the past 15 years, the fact that her party didn't do better when she herself got massively high approval ratings, definitely reflected very poorly on Laschet. So the Greens did very well, their best ever. The FDP came in fourth. The Free Democrats, very business, free market, non-regulatory oriented party. The Left Party, which is the successor to the former East German Communist Party and had for quite a while since unification was sort of the voice of the East, has increasingly lost voters to the far right party, the AfD, which the Alternative for Deutschland, the blue numbers here, and that trend continued quite significantly. Now, to get into the Bundestag, you need to reach 5% of the vote, which the left didn't. But if you get some direct mandates, which they did get enough, 3, they are able to make it into the Bundestag. The other parties, there were a total of 53 parties involved in this election, the most ever. This is also the largest number of people who are voting for a party other than the main parties. So we're really seeing the continuation of a development that's been going on since unification, and particularly sort of the past 15 years, the fragmentation of the German electoral landscape. Let me see. Yes, you can see here from the map on the right that the red, the SPD did very well in the east, in the north, and parts of the west. The CDU, CSU, Merkel's party, did well in the south and the west, and the far right, AfD, did well in the east. The Greens have done well, particularly in cities. The question that I will get to in a couple of minutes has to do with what coalition will ultimately rule the country. But first, let me make it clear that the SPD was the big winner, obviously, not just winning the Bundestag, the federal parliament, but also winning the 2 states that had elections. And those were the states of Berlin. Berlin is both a city and a state, won by the SPD under Franziska Giffey, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, up in the north and the east, won by the incumbent in the SPD, Manuela Schwesig. So here they are celebrating with Olaf Scholz these really phenomenal results for the SPD, which people have been counting out the SPD in recent years because its popularity was plummeting. But at least judging by opinion polls before the elections, people really liked Scholz. And while in the US, personalities generally play a major role in elections, sometimes more than parties, in Germany, it's always been the opposite. The party sort of dominates. But in this case, personalities seem to matter, and people seem to trust and sort of like Scholz better. Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, up in the most northeastern part of Germany along the Baltic coast. Here's the leader, Manuela Schwesig, the minister president. You can see that the far right came in second, the AfD, and then the CDU and the others. In Berlin, there will be, for the first time ever, a female mayor, Franziska Giffey. The SPD won 21.4% of the vote, followed by the Greens. And there were moments when it seemed like Bettina Jarasch of the Greens, when it seemed the Greens were going to win. But when they finally counted the ballots, all of the ballots, which took a lot of time, I'll get to that in a minute, it became clear the SPD had won. But there are very much still remnants of the East-West division more than 30 years after unification. This map shows the strength of this far-right party in each state. They're much stronger in the East. So you can see the 5 darker blue states in the East range from 8% of the vote in Berlin to 27.5% of the vote in Saxony, and high numbers also in Sachsen-Anhalt and Brandenburg, whereas the party is much weaker in the West. So here's how that far-right party did in the states in the East. Now the East is only 15% of the German population. It's 12.5 million of the 83 million people. So, you know, these certainly can't dominate elections, but it makes clear that there are still differences. The AfD particularly champions itself as the party, increasingly really the party of the East, the party of people who are frustrated, and the party of xenophobia. In addition to winning let me back up for a second and make a comment about the German electoral system, where there are 2 votes. The first vote is called sort of the direct mandate, the direct election, where you vote for a person in particular. The second vote is for a party. Now, over the years, people are increasingly splitting their votes. It used to be that first sort of named vote and the second party vote were both from the same party, but you know, upwards of 20% of Germans are now splitting their votes. So in those first votes where you directly vote for a candidate, the AfD also won 16 direct elections, all from the East. And 4 years ago, they won only 3 instead of 16. So voters are coming from particularly the CDU and the left, joining the AfD in the East. Big loss, as I mentioned before, for the left party, even though their focus on social justice is that part of their platform is very close to the SPD, and you know, the SPD clearly won some voters back, or maybe for the first time, from the left party. As I was a fair amount in the East, I was looking at some of the campaign slogans. The AfD in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, take back your state, meaning from people from the West, meaning from this sense of colonialization of the East by the West. It could also mean take back your state from foreigners, from immigrants. The left party in Mecklenburg had a slogan, give voice to the East. That's what we do. In Brandenburg, the poster on the bottom right in red says East, respect, dignity, recognition. And on the subject of respect, the final campaign rally of the left in Berlin in front of the main city hall, the Rotes Rathaus, had this wonderful warm-up band, and the singer, a female singer, one of the songs she sang was indeed Aretha Franklin's Respect. So it was a funny moment seeing this, left party, most, people from the former East Germany often singing along to Aretha Franklin's Respect. The coronavirus, of course, played a role. And you can see on the top right, the AfD's poster says, wash your hands, not your brains, meaning don't be brainwashed by what the government has been saying. The next steps. Germany, since the foundation of West Germany in 1949, no government, no party has ever had enough votes to form a majority on its own. So Germans are always ruled by coalition governments. 4 years ago, it took nearly 6 months to come to an agreement on a coalition. And at the last minute, the man here on the bottom, Lindner of the FDP, pulled out of talks on a coalition. And so people are a bit worried. They're watching closely this time, might that happen again? Everybody's talking about the likelihood of the traffic light coalition with the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. We'll see. Now, the picture on the left is something that to me is really an amazing thing about Germany, especially compared to the United States in elections. The night, like 2 hours after the polls close, all the leading candidates go on TV together for what here it's called the Berliner Runde, but traditionally it's been called the Elefantenrunde, the elephant circle, the big people with journalists talking about the results and beginning sounding each other out or making statements on possible coalitions. So both Scholz, who won with the SPD, and Laschet, who came in second with the CDU, both of them right away said, I will be the next chancellor, and I'm looking forward to coalition talks with the two next most popular parties, the Greens and the FDP. So the interesting development, people were wondering, sort of who's going to go first, who's going to start talking first. Well, what happened last night is that the two at the bottom of your screen, the Greens and the FDP, started talking on their own last night. And here's a picture of them. They posted this selfie on all of their social media, saying that the two parties, the Greens and the FDP, first want to figure out how close they can bring each other toward their desired goals and ruling coalition. Then they'll have to decide, are they going to go with the SPD, which the Greens want to, or are they going to go with the CDU, which the FDP would like to? The top, in terms of coalitions, the top 5 of these are possible, but it's the traffic light, the Ampel coalition that everyone is saying is the most likely, the SPD, with those two other parties, the Greens and the FDP. But of course, the CDU is also interested in ruling with those two political parties, what they call a Jamaica coalition because of the colors of the flag of Jamaica. Now, it's also the case that the current government, the grand coalition of the two biggest parties, the SPD and CDU, could also form a coalition. They've said they don't want to and don't expect to, but we'll see what happens. So a few final remarks before I turn things over to Eric. As I mentioned, with the delegation that I just accompanied to Germany, we traveled to Halle, which is in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, a former East German state, where we met with Dr. Karamba Diaby of the SPD. He's already a member of the Bundestag and he won re-election again. Jana Marx, well, let me go back to Diaby for a second. Given that this is the East and that the far right is quite strong and very anti-immigrant and tends to be very racist, this gives a very different picture of the East, that you can have someone who is Black, who in fact is originally from Senegal, running and winning to be in the Bundestag. In the middle, Jana Marx came from Ukraine as a young girl and now was running for the FDP. She didn't make it. And Ines Brock from the Greens, who successfully made it into the parliament. Our group, I mentioned that we attended 2 final campaign rallies, and these could not have been 2 more different events. The first was with the left, which had a lot of older people, leaving aside the young candidate, Janine Wissler. We met with them at their rally, and we went from there to meet with the opposite kind of group, basically a bunch of young men, sort of yuppies, with the Free Democrats. And that event was held in the courtyard of the Royal Porcelain Manufacturer, KPM, in Berlin, and included a speech by the man who owns the business, showing, the FP cares about business owners. So very different kind of rallies. It was great to be at both of them. And finally, why have we ended up with the results that we have right now? And what does this mean for the future? Just a couple of words, and I will turn this over to Eric. So partly we are where we are because there were mistakes made by the Greens and by the CDU. Baerbock of the Greens was caught for plagiarism of parts of her dissertation this summer, which I, as a professor, this drives me nuts. And by the way, there's several German politicians, leading politicians, who have gotten in trouble because they plagiarized their dissertations or parts of them. It's like having a doctorate in Germany is so respected that many seem to be willing to go to rather extreme, I would say, lengths to get one. And then Laschet of the CDU, I mentioned his massive faux pas and laughing and not paying attention during President Steinmeier's speech in honor of the flood victims. And aside from the mistakes made by others, including someone in the CDU who was caught making a lot of money for selling the medical masks for COVID, that didn't help the CDU either. But, Scholz's personality seemed to also really help him. While the others were making mistakes, he stayed calm. Those are sort of short-term reasons why we are where we are. Longer-term reasons for the fact that the SPD and the Greens have done so well is that there is this movement toward the left. Germans really, really, it means a lot to them to have a strong social safety net. And the environment is also a major issue. So the SPD and the Greens both really stand for both of these things. And the more extremist parties, the left party on the left and the AfD on the right, have gotten less support. Also with COVID, with the pandemic, it's become really clear to people how much they need medical care and state involvement in helping them. And this helped the SPD as well. So finally, what does this mean for the next several months for the US, for Europe, for Germans? Well, the first thing it means is that Germans are going to be distracted for the next few months until there is, in fact, a new ruling government coalition in order. There's a lot of pressure on them for all sorts of reasons to get this done. One of those reasons is that in January, Germany takes over as the leader of the G7, and so they want to be clear on who's in charge. More exact contours of German foreign policy and domestic policy will depend on the constellation of the new ruling coalition. Neither Scholz nor Laschet has pushed for major changes in policy toward the US or the world. The Greens have come out strongly for a critical stance toward Russia, which is different from the traditional SPD way of reaching out to Russia. The FDP has made it clear they don't want to keep bailing out other European countries in financial difficulty, whereas the SPD tends to want to help. And finally, it remains to be seen how stable will a coalition of three major parties be? And how much will this mean that the Chancellor dominates less than has been the case so far? The Chancellor has, has played a really outsized role normally in German policies. But if suddenly you've got either Scholz or Laschet, who's got both the Greens and the FDP that he's got to pay attention to, things can get complicated. So it's not over. And I'm excited to hear about Eric's trip and his views on these historic elections. So Eric, over to you.
All right, thanks so much. Well, you've covered a lot of ground. I also put a little PowerPoint together, so I'm going to share my screen and, got to get the right one ready to go. Here we go. Sorry. All right, so I was also on an election trip, which was sponsored by the International Association for the Study of German Politics, with also very generous support from the DAAD. So I just have some pics here. We had briefings in the Bundestag, which has just stunning architecture. This is the view of, I guess, the old city center. from the top of the Bundestag dome. We actually had briefings in the, I guess, Europa-Ausschuss, so the Europe Committee, which is also a beautiful space. I also noticed that AfD poster hanging around Berlin, and I was also at the rally for the FDP. I didn't even know you were there. Otherwise, we could have said hello. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the speech of the owner of the factory, because my takeaway was that, you know, politicians should speak in political context and businessmen should speak in business context, because it was a very weird speech. He talked, for instance, about how, you know, KPM was founded. It's Berlin's oldest business, and it was founded by Frederick the Great in 1763. And then he says, you know, Christian Lindner, you and Frederick the Great have many similarities. You both care about freedom, right? Because they're all about Freiheit. And I'm thinking to myself, I think I almost choked on my currywurst, because I was thinking, I'm like, Frederick the Great was a despot. I mean, an enlightened despot, sure, but a despot who did not care about freedom. Well, maybe freedom for other Junkers and rich people. So maybe that's what the FDP guy meant. But still, it was very weird. And then he went on and on about how we can't have a wealth tax. We can't have more taxes. We need our profits because we reinvest our profits and create jobs for people. And I thought, this is Ronald Reagan 2.0. And I also thought, I saw a lot of yachts in the, you know, lakes around Berlin. So, you know, somebody's living in luxury. I don't know about that. A couple of other just points about the results before I get into some. I'm a political scientist, so I can't help but share a couple of, you know, quick and dirty calculations with you. But just to kind of comment on some of the things that that Hope talked about. First, with the electoral system, indeed, Germans have two votes, one for a constituency and then one for a party. And about half of the Bundestag is from these single member constituencies. And then, well, more than half, as I'll talk about in a second, comes from these lists using a form of proportional representation. It's important to point out that the winner of the constituency is decided by single member plurality. So the candidate with the most votes wins. This is one of the reasons that the AfD ended up getting 16 of these direct mandates, because with a 3 or 4 party race, you can win with 32% of the vote, right? So I do want to point that idiosyncrasy out. Of course, overall, it's the second vote, the proportional vote, that matters in the end. And as we'll see, the Germans have an extremely proportional system. All right, now, one of the problems is that sometimes parties will win more of these first mandates than their vote share would entail. So what that would mean is that, you know, a party gets 38% of the seats instead of 36% of the seats. So if that's the case, then the parties get to keep those extra seats. Those are called overhanging mandates. The number of overhanging mandates has increased quite a bit over time. There was also, actually, there were a series of constitutional court decisions that said that that was unfair, because you're starting to get more vote seat discrepancy. So the response to that was a new electoral law, or changes to the electoral law in 2013, which, in addition to overhanging mandates, now has so-called compensatory mandates to ensure better seat vote correspondence. So this is really good for the smaller parties. But what it means is, it means that the size of the Bundestag changes after every election. The legal minimum is 598. This last Bundestag had 709 members. This new Bundestag, which they're calling the XXL Bundestag, has 735 members, which makes it the second largest legislative body in the world, behind China. There's more members of the Bundestag than there is in the European Parliament, even though Europe's population is much, much, much larger than Germany's population. This is also going to cost taxpayers tens of millions of extra dollars, and they don't even have enough space for all of these extra members. They're building a new office building, but it's not going to be ready in time. So now they're thinking about renting hotels, getting containers. It's a big mess. In one of our briefings, actually, from an Spd staff member, he acknowledged that they tried to tweak this election law for a year and a half. Then it got vetoed by the Bavarians because they benefit from the current system more than others. But they know that this needs to be a big priority in the next election. And the most likely outcome will be that they'll reduce the number of constituencies. Currently, they have 298, but they'll probably reduce them to 250 or maybe even fewer, which creates other issues as well. But I did want to talk about the XXL Bundestag and just the extra cost that entails with no real benefit. The other thing I want to talk about is the proportion of women. Germany was making really good progress in terms of, let's say, approaching gender parity. They aren't near, but at least they were approaching it. So after the 2013 election, for instance, the share of women deputies was 36.5%. That actually plummeted the last time round in 2017, where the share went down to 30.7%. And that was almost all because of the AfD, which is not particularly supportive of women, if I could put it that way. But also the FDP, the liberals, have also lagged other parties in terms of putting women candidates on their list. Both of them did a little better this time around. And actually, the proportion of women increased to 34.7. So it's still below the peak in 2013 of 36.5, but at least the movement seems to be in the right direction. I should also note, I was happy that Hope mentioned the candidates with a migration background. I'm still waiting for specific data on that. Historically, the number of deputies has really lagged the proportion of the population that has a migration background. It might increase slightly this time, but I don't expect it to be anywhere near parity. But it is noteworthy that two transgender deputies were elected for the first time, which I know is quite a big deal for many Germans, and especially folks in the LGBTQ plus community. So I did kind of want to mention that. And then finally, I would note that the turnout rate ticked up slightly. So it's at 76.6%, and that was up 0.2 from 76.4 the last time around. So not a big increase. That actually surprised me a little bit, because one of the other things that everybody was talking about is the use of mail ballots, which was up to about 40% by some estimates this time. But again, we're waiting for final figures, because many people requested a mail ballot, but then in the end voted in person. So we'll have to see those figures. But that was another big kind of overall trend. Now, in terms of the basic electoral dynamics and outcomes, I'm going to disagree just a little bit with Hope and one of the points that she made. It seems that the left kind of did better, and certainly the SPD did, and I think that is really the banner headline from this election. It's not just that they increased their share by over 5% from 2017, but for years after the 2017 election, including until like May or June, they were at 15, maybe 16% in the polls. And the fact that they came in 10% higher than that long-term polling average is actually a huge achievement. And that all the credit actually goes to Olaf Scholz. But if you add the CDU, CSU, FDP and AfD vote share together, they come in at 45.9% of the vote. If you add the SPD, the Greens, and the Left Party together, they come in at 45.4% of the vote. So actually, overall, Germany is slightly more to the right than to the left, but it really is kind of divided almost 50-50. The other thing I do want to mention as well is the percentage of Germans that voted for other parties, which was at 8.7%. Now, that, I mean, they've had 5%. One, I think after the 2013 election, it was almost 15%, because several parties barely missed coming into parliament. But still, you have 6 different caucuses, if we include the CDU, CSU as one, because they always caucus together. You have 6 different, parties in parliament, and still, just short of 10% of Germans are voting for some other kind of alternative. I think that's one of the outcomes that we're going to have to kind of reflect on and think about in the future, because that would mean much, much more fragmentation in the end. All right, so maybe I'll go over some of my calculations really quickly, just to show you the big picture. So this is a calculation that I like an awful lot. It's the effective number of parties, and you can calculate it based on votes or based on seats. And you can see that I only did it after unification, but until the early 2000s, Both of these, more important is the effective number of parties based on seats, because those are the actual power dynamics in the Bundestag, right? And you can see that it hovered around 3 for a long time. And back in the old Federal Republic, it was also 3 or lower. This meant that Germany was classified as a moderate multi-party system. But what we see starting around 2000 is a lot of change. And that's one of my messages, right? That I don't think we should overinterpret this particular election result, because there's been some churn in German politics going back 20 years at this point. So we can see that it starts to, rise to 2009. 2013 was this big anomaly because both the FDP and the AfD barely missed coming into parliament, right? Germany's electoral law, I've called an over-engineered mess at this point, which is why I really, really hope that they do something to kind of simplify the electoral law. But one of the stipulations is that a party needs to get 5% of the national vote to be eligible for seats in parliament. And both the FDP and the AfD came in at like 4.9, 4.7. They barely missed that threshold. So this was kind of an anomalous, even one might say artificial result in 2013. But then you can see in 2017 and now 2021 that the effective number of parties continues to rise, and it's just below 5 now, which in my research is the threshold to classify a party system as an extreme multi-party system. So there's lots of evidence that this kind of fragmentation of German politics, the decline of the 2 Volksparteien, the catch-all parties, CDU and SPD, is real. Right. And you have all sorts of different and more complex dynamics when you get into extreme multi-party system territory. I mean, ask the Italians, who have lived with that for decades at this point. All right. I thought I'd also show volatility. Again, a measure of kind of like how much change is happening from one election to the next. And you can see, and by the way, the global average for volatility over 100 years is about 8.9%. And so you can see that, and again, you can do it based on votes or seats. And again, you can see until the early 2000s, things were relatively stable and you had average levels of volatility. But volatility continued to increase until 2017. And literally this morning, I got up really early because of jet lag. So I just did these calculations. But volatility has now declined and it's starting to approach a stable level. So it was actually 2013 and 2017 that were the highly volatile elections, right? Again, because of the rise of the AfD for 2017, their entry into parliament as the 3rd largest party in 2017. But now we see that volatility is starting to decline. So that's a good thing, because a lot of volatility over a long period of time would really be a red flag for the overall stability of the system. All right, I talked before about overhanging compensatory mandates. You can see, so this election was actually the 20th election since the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. So this will be the 20th electoral period. And you can see for decades and decades and decades, there were very few overhanging mandates. Of course, it's only from 18 onwards that you also have these compensatory mandates. So it wasn't that much of an issue. But you can also see starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, those started to kind of increase. So what this means is that, if you looked at the first vote totals, the CDU would get, let's say, 45% of the first vote totals, and then they get 43% of the second vote total. So there wasn't that much kind of deviation. But what's been happening recently is people are splitting their votes much more, which means there's much more of a discrepancy, and it's much harder to get a better vote seat correspondence. But you can see that we have almost 140 overhanging and compensatory mandates in this last election. So it's really a problem from a variety of perspectives. And, we could talk about their theoretical reasons why you don't want to have a too large parliament. And Germany is the poster child for that right now. I thought I'd show you the SPD Vote Share. This is over the longue durée. I did it just for Hope because I know that she's a proud historian, right? But you can see like the SPD, I mean, the banner headline was that in 2017, their 20.5% of the vote was their worst result since like 1890. Right, but now they've kind of increased their share again. But you can see the vicissitudes of SPD support over time. It's an open question about whether they'll be able to maintain even 25% of the vote going forward. I mean, we'll see about that. And then finally, I don't have data for vote splitting yet for 2021. It'll take a little longer to get the fine-grained data to be able to figure that out. But you can see that, this has been increasing, consistently since the 1970s, but has really started to reach 25. It's probably 30% this time around of voters splitting their votes. So yeah, there's much more I could talk about. Maybe I'll share some anecdotes from the trip, because the nice thing about these study trips is it's not just the great data that you get access to, but it's also the stories and interpreting the people that come and speak, right? So a couple of things. First, we had a woman from the FDP Berlin come to talk about the FDP, and she talked about how, oh, we're all about the issues, not personalities. And again, I almost choked on my coffee, because the FDP has been involved in what I would consider to be kind of a cult of personality over the last couple of elections, with their photogenic leader, Christian Lindner, who also spoke at this FDP rally. Like literally, all you see in their posters is this massive like GQ pose with Christian Lindner, right? And so I asked her that, right? And of course we were told, make it a question, not a comment. So I said, this is a comment, but I'll pretend that it's a question. I said, were you serious when you said it was about issues and not like personalities? And then, I called her on that, and she's like, well, okay, fine. Like, you found us. We try to make it about issues, but she said, unter uns, between us, Germans don't care about issues. They care about personalities. And that was a bad thing to hear. I heard that from a lot of other politicos as well, because I always tell my students here that German politics is much more policy oriented. People care about platforms and things like that, but the politicals don't agree with that. But I do want to try to save my position somehow. And what I would say is, I would say that Germans, they distill the policies into their perceptions of the candidates. That's what I think. And so, Lindner is pretty popular because he's young and dynamic. And that's how the FDP is trying to present themselves, with this heavy emphasis on digitalization, right? Scholz was portrayed as this kind of steady hand, right? What was their campaign slogan was that, Scholz packt das an, Scholz will tackle it, right? Like, you can trust him, he will do it. And, also a little bit more social justice, right? So their big issue that everybody talked about was raising the minimum wage to 12 euros per hour or something like that. A couple of other random things. I agree 100% with what Hope said about the very poor campaigns that the Greens and the CDU ran. I was actually doing a talk for some students the other day, and I swear, if you look at the main television ads, you can see why parties did well or didn't do well. The Greens had this really awkward ad where they took an old folk song and they greened the lyrics, and then had like a random sampling of Germans kind of sing it. It was just weird. Their campaign posters also didn't really resonate. They went with a different shade of green than you're used to, and like the faces of the main candidates were also in that green. So and they kind of looked like something out of Halloween than an actual ad. And the CDU, oh my God, I just love this. It's all about Laschet, right? And you see Laschet walking out of a mine because his father was a coal miner or something like that, right? And Laschet has ash, like coal ash, on his face. But then you see all the other like dozen people walking out with him, and nobody else has ash on his face. Then you see him a little later on having a serious chat with leaders of various groups in the Holocaust Memorial, like within like the stones of the Holocaust Memorial, which people, and well, me too, think is kind of an inappropriate image for a political campaign ad. So yeah, those are some of the things. Oh, we also met an AfD guy, and that was really fascinating. He's like the second in command of the Berlin AfD chief, and he presented himself as the sane, or what did he call it, national conservative wing of the AfD. And he actually was very kind of critical towards like the right populist, more Eastern, insane wing of the AfD. So that was kind of fascinating. But I remember he kept saying, the AfD needs to root itself more in civil society. He said, tennis clubs, golf clubs, the PTA at your child's boarding school. And I'm thinking, this is what you think civil society is? That's a very class-specific understanding of what civil society might be. He also said that he thinks the problem with the AFD is that they're not serious and they don't want to govern. And he thinks that from his perspective, the AFD has to get serious and be ready to govern, or they'll cease to exist in 2 more electoral cycles, right? But, of course, he was completely contradictory, because then later on he said, well, of course, nobody's really voting for us because of the issues. It's rather the feeling, right? Like what Hope was saying in the East, the feeling of being hard done by, right? The feeling of not being respected, the feeling of having your culture that you've come to love be changed by all these, newcomers from outside and from different cultures, kind of thing. I'm like, well, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't be the protest party. You can't have people voting for you for a feeling and having candidates that will provide you raw meat for that feeling, right? And then at the same time, advocate for becoming a more mature party that's going to be ready to govern. So I don't know. It was really interesting. It shows just the tensions within that party. It shows the dangers of that party as well. And I was very happy that they came in much less than they did before. From one perspective, they got 12.6% back in 2017. They got 10.3% this time. They lost 20% of their support from 4 years ago. So that's kind of the good news. The bad news is that over that entire term, they never dipped below 9% in the polls, and they came in at 10.3. So I think they're increasingly institutionalized. I think that they're also increasingly the Eastern Identity Party. One of the reasons the Left Party, which used to play that role, did so poorly. So they could be here and more institutionalized than I think people were hoping for. I would also point out, by the way, and I asked CDU people this, SPD people this, nobody still knows what the right strategy or tactic is to deal with the AFD, right? One of the SPD people said that we're trying to engage them, but still be distanced from them. I'm like, what does that mean, right? Like it's a very hard thing to define or to actually do. But anyway, I've talked long enough, so I guess I will conclude now and hand it back to Hillary.
Thank you so much. This is great. First of all, I love the anecdotes, and I love, we all miss here the TV ads and the rallies and the campaign posters. So thank you for bringing that back to us. We have a couple of questions. One is already here from our colleague Mary Beth Stein, who said that she's interested in hearing that the Greens and FDP are trying to find common ground when they represent very different constituencies. So you have your climate activists versus your business interests. At the national level, there's never been a traffic light coalition, and she's wondering just how likely the two of them will be able to work together in a coalition, which is, I think, the real, the real question of why it's going to take 6 months maybe to make a government. So we have that question. And then one of our other Hope and I work with a third co-organizer of the Europe Since COVID study group. And the third member of our triumvirate is Catherine Kleppinger, and she has a question too. So let me ask her to just ask it, Catherine. Hopefully Matt will give you a microphone.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Matt. Now I'm sorry I was a few minutes late, so I missed the very beginning, but it's great to see everyone and to learn more about this. My background is from France, so you can probably see me coming a mile away here, which is how these sort of uncertain results might impact the French-German cooperation, particularly given the importance to the European Union, and with the added complexity of French elections coming up during France's own presidency of the European Union Council. And so it just kind of, I realize the answer is probably so many different factors are unknown, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how we situate this in the European context, and in particular, the French-German axis.
Excellent, excellent. And please, the rest of you, those two questions to get you guys started, foreign policy, EU policy, as well as coalition formation, strange bedfellows, I would call it. But others of you in the audience, feel free to add your questions in the chat. So please, Hope, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Mary Beth and Catherine for the questions. Yeah, I mean, Mary Beth's question is, the one everybody has on their minds, can first the FDP and the Greens come to some sort of agreement on what they're willing to compromise to be able to work together with the SPD. I mean, what people have said in terms of a distribution of posts is that the vice chancellor and foreign minister would be Robert Habeck of the Greens. So a Green foreign minister. The last time we had that was Joschka Fischer, starting in 1998 under Schroeder's government. Lindner of the FDP has long said he, would want the finance ministry. And of course, Annalena Baerbock of the Greens would want the environmental ministry. So, those are the key issues that those posts within them have all sort of issues that they need to work out. I mean, and absolutely these first sort of sounding out of each other, of the FDP and the Greens, where the FDP wants to get rid of all these regulations and, let businesses sort of, you feel like almost do what they want. Whereas the Greens is like, we've got to regulate all of this. So, where is the middle ground is exactly what they're going to be looking for, including on spending. I mean, that same issue in foreign policy and the EU, where the Greens are more sort of solidarity with others, and we're all in this together, and we need to help others in the EU. The FDP, are much more, no, we don't. Let's keep our money for ourselves and for our own businesses and not help get others out of trouble from poor financial policy. So I guess I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Eric for both of those questions.
I mean, I don't have too much more to add. The first thing that I would, I guess, mention is a little bit of context. So back in 2017, Merkel tried to negotiate this Jamaica coalition of CDU, Greens, and FDP, and that failed. And so then she had to go back to a grand coalition. This is why it took 6 months. But we shouldn't forget that it was a disagreement between the FDP and Greens in 2017, I think over coal power, that led to that. In fact, one of the words of the year, actually the Wort des Jahres, was Jamaica aus, so like the shattering of those negotiations. And the runner-up was a new verb, zu lindern, right, named after Lindner, right, which basically means to negotiate in bad faith and then to walk out at the last second, right? So I think it's a really good step that those two parties are having, let's say, pre-negotiations to kind of make sure that they're on the same page and that we're not going to have a repeat of the last time. I think that everybody realizes that waiting 6 months for a new election is not ideal. So I'm actually quite surprised at how quickly and efficiently things seem to be working this time around. Now, one other point about Jamaica versus the traffic light coalition. So the SPD won the election, they came in first, so they have the right to try to form the first government. So I don't think that it's very likely that the Greens and the FDP are going to sit there and say, oh, well, actually, maybe we would prefer Jamaica over a traffic light. It would be very difficult for them to try to maneuver that way without even giving Scholz a chance to kind of convince them that a traffic light would be a good thing. The other thing I would mention too is that it really is going to matter who the finance minister is, because the finance minister in Germany has a kind of special place in the cabinet. One might say even more so than the vice chancellor, right? Because the finance minister can veto certain spending items, right? He or she can say nine to this or that. So it will matter if Lindner gets the finance ministry versus a Green versus a Green or a Social Democrat in terms of the more ambitious spending plans. Remember that the Greens want to invest $50 billion or euros in infrastructure, digital infrastructure, climate infrastructure. And that would be money that would have to be borrowed, or you'd have to raise taxes to pay for. And so that's going to be a real kind of sticking point in the negotiations. Although maybe not so much. I think that Lindner and the FDP, they've really focused on digitalization the last two elections. So they'd be hard pressed to say no to a modest spending plan that will get, because Germany has some infrastructure issues, that's for sure. So we'll see if that deal can be made. Now, about like the France and EU dimension, I think a lot of people thought that Laschet would have been more like pro-French, pro-Macron, a federal Europe, if only because he comes from Aachen, which is literally 4 kilometers from, I think, the Belgian border, right? So very kind of like, European heartland kind of guy. Scholz, coming from Hamburg, I think had the reputation of being more of a transatlanticist. I mean, not necessarily not pro-Europe, but might balance these things a little differently. But I'm not so sure about that. I mean, let's not forget that Laschet, as the finance minister, was deeply involved in the negotiations last year over kind of joint EU debt, right? So I don't know. I think
you mean Scholz.
Scholz. Oh yeah, Scholz. Sorry, did I say Laschet? Yeah, Scholz, as the finance minister, was deeply involved in that those negotiations. So like he's shown his kind of pro-federal European bona fides. But I think he's going to be more cautious. He's going to be more pragmatic. I don't think that he's going to, sign up for Macron's latest kind of pro-European fantasy, which has very little support, I think, in Germany amongst the electorate or even the political class. But we might see more baby steps towards greater kind of federal integration. It's not, I mean, Scholz even went so far as to do the Merkel-Raute, the rhombus, right, in some of his campaign stops to show that he was the continuation of Merkel. But that wasn't just for show. I really think he's going to be more Merkelian than Macronian in his approach towards Europe, but maybe a little bit more, and maybe like late Merkel, right? Because Merkel's stance towards Europe kind of changed over time, and it really was significant that she came around to support the kind of joint debt last year. So, he might be more late Merkel than early Merkel when it comes to those things, or at least mid Merkel with the Euro crisis and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think there's going to be, a groundswell of support for a more ambitious Macronian European ideal. The one thing that let me just say 2 more things. Sorry. First, if Marine Le Pen ever wins, like if she wins the French presidency next year, then that's going to be a crisis, right? That's going to be an absolute kind of, who knows what's going to happen if she gets elected. So, I mean, I'm hoping that doesn't happen, just, saying. And the other thing that I would say, and I brought this up in a lot of the briefings that we had, this AUKUS deal, where we in the United States kind of undermined the French submarine order to Australia to replace it with our own kind of nuclear subs. I don't think people in Washington, D.C. are quite understanding just how much of a blow this was, not just to the French, but to the Europeans. And I'm really worried, and I asked this, actually, it was the head of policy planning from the Foreign Office that we were meeting with. So I kind of made this point to him. I said, there's the famous Merkel speech from a couple of years ago, when she said, I think the time that we can rely on others for our security have come to an end, which was widely interpreted as her saying that you can't rely on the US, you can't rely on NATO the way that you used to. We need to start to invest in our own kind of European focused defense capabilities. I think that when Biden was elected, there was a massive sigh of relief in Europe. And I've seen the public opinion polls. Europeans weren't really supportive of the last president, whose name I won't say. And so they were happy for this kind of breath of fresh air. But I think that window of goodwill fresh breathing that Biden had. I think that's over, and I'm really worried that this submarine deal is like the kind of like last straw where the Europeans are going to say, you know what, we're going to double down and do our own thing, and forget about the U.S. security guarantee, or Britain for that matter.
Right. So we have a couple more questions that bring up. So one is about, to continue on the foreign policy thing, is about China. And I think maybe you might want to add a little on Russia as well with respect to the Nord Stream pipeline. These are two foreign policy issues looking eastward rather than westward to the EU and France. And we have two other questions that came in the chat. One is about why the AfD did so well in Sachsen in particular, compared to some of the other Eastern Länder. And a second one, which is one that engages me somewhat from my studies in Berlin, how come the Linke has done so poorly in most of the Eastern Länder? They continue to do well in some of the Bezirke in Berlin, and in the eastern districts of Berlin, but they do quite poorly now in this last election. And what does the future hold for the Linke?
Okay, thanks. I'll take a crack at some of those. And there are also a couple of other points I wanted to make. So I talked about Die Linke in my comments. So I think they've just lost out to the AfD, which somehow has been more effective at my understanding is that the AfD essentially learned from Die Linke how to really reach out in local communities and help people in local communities, and that they ended up doing that even better than the Linke have. Helping people with jobs or housing subsidies, real sort of regular life issues that Die Linke, had sort of dominated on, and now the AfD is doing even more. Why Saxony? Yes, Saxony has been the stronghold of the far right for years now. This is not new. It started with Pegida. Well, I mean, it didn't start there. There's even before then. There's long been this nationalistic, other people have hurt us, let's protect ourselves. I don't know, some of that may come from, Dresden and World War II and this narrative that was built up in East Germany about Germany as the victim of the Allied bombing attacks. And so a very sort of defensive nationalistic reaction. It may partly come from that. I want to really reiterate what Eric said about the shock, not just in France, but in Germany, about the US, British, Australian military deal. I mean, that happened, I think, like I was leaving for Germany that day or something. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I mean, this is going to be a big deal, because Germans are, like other Europeans, have already been feeling like, the US is moving away from us. And how can we, both in terms of foreign policy and policy toward the US, for both Laschet and Scholz, or for both Scholz and Laschet, making sure the US stays engaged and sort of fighting back, like, US distancing this turn toward China and everything, is going to remain a priority. A couple of other different things on this subject of, Eric mentioned that constitutionally the party with the most votes has the right to go first, with coalition talks. It should also be noted that since the elections on Sunday, in public opinion polls, 68% of Germans want Laschet out. So there is, just not public support for him and for the CDU to be part of the ruling coalition. And the last thing I meant to mention before, and I just wanted to sort of give you all a feeling of what it was like, and a little comparison with the US. On this past Sunday, first of all, it was 75 degrees in Berlin, which is not normal. It was also the day of the Berlin Marathon. So it was sheer insanity in the city. Meanwhile, 2 days before had been Greta Thunberg and the mass demonstrations of Fridays for Future, and everybody out there talking about the need to pay attention to the environment. And there had been some hunger strikers, young hunger strikers, concerned about the climate, demanding that the three leading candidates from the CDU, SPD, and Greens meet with them before the elections. And they upped the hunger strikes to also not drinking any water. All the leaders had been saying, we'll meet with you after the elections. But when some of them stopped drinking water, Scholz of the SPD, called them and said, I will meet with you within, a few weeks of the election. And so they stopped the hunger strike. The day of the election, with the marathon, there were also some ballot problems. Now, these were different than the ballot problems we've had in the United States. One of my good friends was the head of one of the polling stations, and it was also all over the news. And there's now massive pressure on the person in charge of elections in the city of Berlin to resign because of the problems. A couple of problems. First, they didn't send enough ballots to many polling stations. Maybe they thought people had done, mail-in ballots, so they would need less. So a lot of them were really caught off guard, didn't have enough ballots. Frustrated voters had to, call, couldn't get through often. The line was busy to say, need more ballots. But then when they tried to deliver the ballots, the marathon was going on. I mean, streets were closed all over the place. So it took a long time to get those ballots to the polling stations. So counting, went on for several hours into the night, longer than it usually takes to get through them all. And because they couldn't start counting the absentee ballots until the polls had closed at 6 o'clock. So there were some dramatic moments around the city on election day.
It's so exciting. I didn't realize this. So Eric, you want to take a crack at any of these questions?
Just really quick, Saxony and the AfD. I mean, let's not forget that one of the first horrible attacks against foreigners after unification was in Hoyerswerda, right? So it's not just the last 5 or 10 years that they've had a right radical problem. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of unification, if not before, and probably does have a lot to do with this victim mentality that the East German regime fostered with the bombing of Dresden and things like that. But it's a good question, and more research is necessary to truly understand why this is the case. But now it's spreading into Thuringia, Saxony-Anhalt as well. So yeah, that's definitely something to look at. Why did the Linke do so poorly? Well, part of it is a lot of their supporters died compared to 2017. I said the other day that I think Germany's the only country that I can think of where one of the main things that you talk about is, well, how many voters died compared to the last time? This is also one of the reasons the CDU did so poorly, because a lot of their older supporters have passed away. So, there's that. I like my standing line about the left party is that they're trying to foist a 19th century ideology onto a 21st century reality. And I just don't think that resonates so much, especially with the more sophisticated voters that you have in Germany today compared to 1892 or anything like that. So their slogan, tax the rich. Okay, I mean, come on, you gotta be a little bit more specific when it comes to that. Regarding China and Russia, Nord Stream 2 was brought up. I don't think that's going to be an issue anymore. It's basically done. Even the Biden administration gave up on that. But if you've been reading some of the headlines, they're really worried about an energy crisis in Europe this fall and winter because supplies are so tight, right? It's not just in Britain where they don't even have gas at the gas stations, but they're worried about a shortage of natural gas. I think a lot of the Germans are going to be kind of smug about the whole thing and say, okay, you know what? We got our Russian gas coming in. We're not going to have the same kind of spike in prices or supply issues that some of you others are going to have. So I don't think that's going to be so much of an issue. We'll see if it's a green foreign minister, right? Then we might see a different tone and maybe even different policies, because they have really focused much more than any of the other parties on human rights abuses in Russia and especially in China. We'll see. I would expect harsher rhetoric towards Russia than towards China, because the German economy has become so much more dependent on China than 20 years ago. So, I don't think we're going to see a real kind of foregrounding of things like that. Although there might be a slightly more critical tone than we saw under Merkel.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time, and one of the issues that we haven't touched on, but I think is sort of underlies a lot of your comments, is about generational change in the electorate. Because you just mentioned, Eric, the death of supporters for the Linke, and it's sort of the passing in a funny way, like you have a sort of holdout of your East German identity, but nevertheless, that generation is going to pass soon too. And we're seeing support among the younger generation for the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, for the Free Democrats, and the issues that seem to matter to the younger generation seem to be picked up more by the two smaller parties that have gained in support, particularly by the younger generation. So do you want us to just finally, since Hope, especially as an historian, I was thinking that maybe she would reflect on, the last time the SPD was in power, they didn't do so well. People did not like the reform of the welfare state. So what do we see coming down the road in terms of, the actual policies reflected in these electoral results?
Thanks. On this issue of generational change, it's important to note also, you mentioned young people in the Greens and the FDP. The AFD, its main constituency is men under 35. So that is, so they basically did not experience East Germany. This is, just who they are. On the generational issue, though, there are also, the Greens were started, they came out of the 60s. Obviously, they started in the 1980s. They're getting older. And some of them are staying Green, but some of them are moving to the SPD. Since a lot of people become a bit more conservative as they get older. So, one of the people we met with also was joking about the Fridays for Future, the huge demonstration, and these young families pulling up in huge SUVs and dropping off their kids for the Green demonstration. So there was talk of that. My mind, the jet lag is
Well, on policy, I thought that it was foreign policy played very small role in the election, and so did immigration. It kind of disappeared, whereas the floods brought environment to the fore. So that, at least it seemed to me, that was part of the reason that you saw this surge in support.
If I can just jump in for a second.
Sure.
I mean, many of the speakers and some of the colleagues that I was talking to really emphasized the point that you can't just think that all of the young voters are little Greta Thunbergs and Friday for Futures people, right? And in fact, I think that I saw one finding that the whatever younger cohort actually preferred the FDP, the market liberals, over the Greens slightly, right? So I guess we shouldn't just conflate youth with environmental consciousness and everything like that. The other thing too that I forgot to mention before was that, yes, the Greens had their best ever result, and yes, they were up over 5% from their 2017 result, but I still think it was a disappointing night for them, because a couple of months ago, they were polling at 20, 22, 24% of the vote, at one point even higher. So they're down significantly. And in fact, even the last polls had a more like 16%. They came in at 14.8. So, and one of the explanations for that is that like the Greens policy is going to actually directly and materially disadvantage their voters. And that there were probably a lot of voters that at the last second said, you know what? I don't want my taxes to go up. I don't want to give up my SUV. I don't want to drive 100 miles or 100 kilometers per hour on the Autobahns, which is the big thing that they want, right? So I don't know. I'm sure generational change is going to be important, but we can't assume that there's going to be these massive political repercussions from it, because, well-to-do middle-class young people also care about, how much they're taking home every month, and are increasingly aware of the trade-offs, right, between a carbon neutral economy and their own prosperity.
Which might explain why the SPD, that tries to balance those two issues, has done so well. I want to thank both of you. It's always so much fun to engage with you on questions of Germany, and I hope that we'll continue to do so over the year. I want to thank everybody who's come today. We're a little over time, but if you aren't on our mailing list, please put your email in the chat, or send it to Matt Cooley, who you can see in the chat if you drop in the drop-down menu, and we'll add you to our mailing list. And I hope to see you at our next Europe Since COVID events. Would you join me in thanking Eric Longenbacher and Hope Harrison for a great discussion, and thank you for sharing all your anecdotes, because there's nothing like being there.
Yep, that's for sure. Thank you, Hillary, for hosting, and take care, and Auf Wiedersehen, everyone.
Thanks. Nice to see everybody.
Bye, everyone. Hope, can you stay on? Oh, we lost her. Okay. So I have Catherine